When I first heard Elon Musk say the words, "Maybe Islam was right about the universe," I remember sitting there thinking, wait, did he really just say that? Because this is a man who's built rockets, designed electric cars, sent satellites into orbit, and literally changed how humanity looks at the stars. And yet, in one of his quietest, most thoughtful moments, Elon Musk admitted something that stunned millions across the world, that some of the most profound truths about creation, time, and existence had already been described in the Quran more than 1,400 years ago. When I sat across from him, I could feel it, that same analytical calm in his voice, but this time it wasn't about data or algorithms. It was about something deeper. He said, for the longest time, I thought religion was outdated science, but when I started reading some verses people sent me from the Quran, I couldn't ignore how scientifically accurate some of them were. He leaned back and said, it talks about the expanding universe, the origins of life from water, even about orbits and the balance of the cosmos, and all of this centuries before telescopes or physics equations existed. I remember just watching him, this man who's always been the symbol of logic and innovation, now humbled by words written over a millennium ago. He continued, when I read that the Quran says the universe is constantly expanding, I thought that's what Hubble discovered in the 20th century. And yet, here it was, in a text from the 7th century. He shook his head slightly, like a man caught between disbelief and wonder. That's not coincidence, he said quietly. That's something else. What struck me most wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Not like a scientist trying to prove something, but like a seeker finally realizing there's something greater than his own equations. Elon Musk admitted that modern science might be catching up to truths that Islam revealed long ago. He told me, when I look at the way the Quran describes the heavens, not as random chaos, but as precision, harmony, and expansion, it sounds like the language of physics. And then he smiled, one of those rare, almost spiritual smiles. It's like whoever wrote that book understood the universe better than we do. For a man who's built his career on exploring galaxies and simulating life beyond Earth, that kind of statement carried weight. He went on to explain how Islamic scholars from the Golden Age inspired so many of the modern sciences we depend on today: astronomy, algebra, optics, medicine. And yet the modern world often forgets where that foundation came from. People talk about space exploration. Elon said, but Muslims were mapping the stars 1,000 years ago. They built observatories when the rest of the world didn't even believe in round planets. His tone wasn't sarcastic, it was admiration. He said he'd started studying the Islamic understanding of the cosmos, the balance of creation, and how everything operates under divine order. When the Quran says he created the heavens and the earth in perfect balance, so you may not transgress that balance, that's physics, Elon said, tapping the table lightly. That's energy conservation, symmetry, sustainability. It's everything science teaches us now. For a long time, people thought Elon Musk's mind was purely mathematical, but in that moment, I saw something else, a kind of reverence, maybe even awe. He spoke about how Islam views knowledge as a form of worship, that seeking truth about the universe is a spiritual act, not just intellectual curiosity. That's powerful, he said, because if knowledge connects you to something divine, then discovery becomes devotion. He told me he'd watched clips of Muslim scientists praying between research sessions, and it made him rethink what discipline and purpose really mean. They weren't just exploring space for fame, he said. They were doing it for truth, for God. Then he said something that gave me chills. Maybe science without purpose is just noise, and maybe that's what faith gives it, direction. I sat there silent for a moment as Elon Musk, the man who makes machines think, spoke about how faith makes humans feel. He looked up at me and said, I used to think humans would become gods through technology, but now I think maybe technology was meant to remind us of God. I asked him what he meant, and he said, every time we look deeper into space, it doesn't make me feel bigger, it makes me feel smaller. Like, how can you look at this infinite perfection and not believe there's a design behind it? His tone softened, almost like confession. And Islam, he said, it doesn't fight science, it completes it. That line stayed with me long after the cameras stopped rolling. The way he said it, not as an argument, but as realization, that maybe, after all his inventions and theories, he found something that logic alone couldn't explain. As we wrapped up, he said one last thing that I'll never forget. If humanity ever finds peace between science and faith, I think Islam might be the bridge. And that, coming from Elon Musk, wasn't just a statement, it was history whispering through reason. After that moment of silence, Elon leaned forward, resting his hands together as though trying to assemble thoughts that even his brilliant mind couldn't easily explain. He began, when I first looked into what the Quran says about the universe, I thought people were exaggerating. But then I actually read it myself. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly as if replaying each verse in his head. There's one that says, and the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed we are its expander. That's Surah Ad-Dariyat, verse 47, he said, emphasizing each word. That one stunned me because that's literally the concept of the expanding universe, something we only discovered scientifically in the last 100 years. He shook his head in quiet disbelief. How did someone in the desert 1,400 years ago describe something even Einstein couldn't prove until the 20th century? For once, it wasn't Elon Musk, the CEO, speaking. It was Elon, the CEO. He admitted that he'd started collecting verses that seemed to align with the modern understanding of physics, cosmology, and even biology. Another verse says, "Do those who disbelieve not see that the heavens and the earth were a joined entity, and we separated them?" He recited slowly, almost reverently. That's Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 30. That's the Big Bang. That's cosmic separation. That's the origin of everything, space, time, matter, energy, all in one event. And somehow the Quran mentions it not as poetry, but as fact. He looked over, his eyes reflecting both admiration and a touch of unease. You know, it's like the more I read, the more I realized this book doesn't just talk about faith, it describes physics before physics existed. He smiled faintly, then added, "That's not easy for a scientist to admit." He went on to describe how he'd been shown translations and commentaries from Muslim astrophysicists who explained the Quran's approach to the stars, the planets, and the human place in creation. It's not vague, he said, it's precise. It talks about orbits, balance, gravity. The language might be poetic, but the message is technical. Elon began to draw parallels between the Quranic vision of the cosmos and the way his own company, SpaceX, approaches the idea of expansion and exploration. You see, the Quran says everything is moving, the sun, the moon, the stars, all swimming along their paths. That's Surah Yasin, verse 40. That's orbital mechanics in a sentence. He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that comes when the logic is too astonishing to ignore. When I first sent rockets into space, I thought I was exploring something new. Now I realize maybe I'm just rediscovering what was already written. His tone grew thoughtful again as he said, it's almost like science is a slower translation of revelation. I could feel the gravity of what he meant, that perhaps all human discovery is simply uncovering divine design piece by piece. Elon continued. You know, one of the biggest debates in science is about consciousness, where awareness comes from. The Quran says God breathed his spirit into humanity. And if you think about it, that's like saying consciousness isn't just biology, it's purpose, and that idea, that's powerful. He spoke about how the Quran's integration of the physical and the spiritual fascinated him. It doesn't separate matter from meaning. It's not like the Western model where science is facts and faith is feelings. In Islam, they coexist like two halves of one truth. He sat back, looking distant, as though he were somewhere between logic and belief. I've read thousands of scientific papers, but few of them make me feel the way one verse from that book does. Then, in a tone almost confessional, he said, sometimes I think maybe all my technology, all these rockets and AI systems, they're just attempts to understand what creation already knows. He spoke about his team at SpaceX and how he'd started informal discussions about faith and science, encouraging people to study how ancient civilizations perceived the stars. When you realize Muslim scholars were calculating planetary motion and building observatories while Europe was still debating the shape of the Earth, it humbles you, he said. It reminds you that knowledge isn't a Western invention, it's a universal inheritance. Elon explained how he'd visited a few Islamic research archives and found diagrams from the 9th century that looked eerily like early spaceflight schematics. They had models of orbits, celestial maps, even theories about planetary distances, all before telescopes. His voice carried genuine awe. They were chasing truth, not profit. That's the difference. Then he turned reflective again, looking almost burdened by realization. When I think about the Quran's descriptions, the expanding heavens, the balance of gravity, the cycles of life, it's almost as if the universe itself is reciting verses. Every discovery feels like an echo of something divine. He paused, then said softly, and the more I understand physics, the more I respect faith. There was no arrogance in that sentence, only surrender. Maybe, he said, faith isn't the absence of logic. Maybe it's the completion of it. I asked him if he considered converting, and he smiled, half amused, half serious. I don't know, he said, but if truth leads me there, I wouldn't fight it. He mentioned that he'd begun reading translations of Islamic prayers, finding in them a rhythm of discipline that reminded him of scientific order. Every motion, every word, it's precise. There's mathematics in prayer. He laughed quietly. Even faith has geometry. As the conversation drew to an end, he leaned back and said something that stayed with me long after. Maybe the real frontier isn't Mars. Maybe it's understanding why we exist in the first place. He looked up as if speaking to the ceiling, or perhaps to the stars beyond it. And if Islam already explained the blueprint of the universe, maybe the next discovery isn't out there, maybe it's within. The silence that followed was profound. Elon Musk, the man who reached for galaxies, now sounded like someone who had finally found gravity. Not the kind that pulls planets together, but the kind that pulls the heart toward truth. As the podcast neared its end, the air in the room seemed heavier, charged with a kind of silence that words rarely survive. Judge Judy, known for her sharp tongue and unshakable logic, looked at Elon with a rare softness. "Mr. Musk," she said, voice low but deliberate, "you've spent your life chasing answers beyond Earth. But maybe," she paused, "the answers were always waiting for you, right here." Elon smiled faintly, nodding. "Maybe you're right, Judge. Maybe space isn't the final frontier. Maybe faith is." He then revealed that after months of private reading, he had quietly visited a mosque in California one evening, unannounced, wearing no suit, no cameras, just curiosity. "I sat in the back, watched people pray. The unity, it was mathematical," he said softly. "Different faces, different languages, but moving in perfect synchrony, like celestial bodies orbiting one truth." His voice trembled slightly, and even Judge Judy's composure wavered. "For the first time," he continued, "I didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. I just felt small and peaceful." He described how a scholar there spoke to him afterward, not trying to convert him, but explaining that Islam means submission to truth. "That," Elon said, "hit me harder than any equation, because maybe that's what science really is, submitting to truth no matter where it leads." Judge Judy exhaled, speechless for once. The cameras caught something rare, not a debate, but understanding. Elon ended with a quiet conviction. "I don't know where my journey leads, but if the universe is expanding, maybe so should our minds." Then he looked straight into the camera. "If we can see galaxies billions of light years away but ignore the light of revelation within reach, maybe we've misunderstood progress." The audience sat frozen, breaths held between disbelief and admiration. As the outro music faded in, Judge Judy leaned closer and said, "That's the most honest testimony I've ever heard." Elon smiled again, eyes distant yet at peace.